Hello, I'm Johanna Marin-Carbonne. I'm professor at University of Lausanne, and today I will discuss some aspect of the early Earth and early life. So this is an artistic view of what should look like a planet just after its birth. So it's not a very hospitable world. You can see that it's a molten ball of gas and dust that we can call a magmatic ocean. You can see a lot of this very hot lava on this picture. And we still have a lot of bombardment from meteorites. So it's not the perfect place for life to flourish. But we know that during the early Earth, we are following this step from something that is very unhospitable during the Hadean, so during the first stage of the planet history, of the Earth history, that you can see also on this artistic view on the top picture, that you have this molten lava lake, a lot of meteorites, and a very dusty atmosphere, so very non-hospitable world. But as the planet aged a little bit during the Archean, from 4 to 2.5 billion years old, the world is becoming more and more habitable. We have still a lot of volcanoes, but we have a lot of liquid water, and we know that life can have appeared during that time, and this is what I will discuss today. So the two questions I want to discuss is what was the Earth's surface condition, so what was the temperature, the composition of the ocean and the atmosphere, and when life did emerge. So first, let's look at what is a Precambrian. So here you have the geological time scale from 4.5 billion years when the planet is formed to now, where we are living today. And most of this time, until the first evidence of shelled animals, is called the Precambrian. So it's 4 billion years old of the planet history, and this is a very crucial time for a lot of geological events, but also for life to appear and evolve. So first, let's look like what is the Precambrian. This is a major part of time of the Earth's history. Here you can see on the geological scale that starts at 4.5 billion years old with the planet birth or the planet formation, and then finish today with us living now. And most of this time is between 4.56 to 500 million years, when the first animals that have a skeleton have appeared. It's called the Precambrian. And this period of time is very long and is crucial to understand how the planet has been hospitable and how life has appeared and evolved during this time. But as a geologist, we will look from the geological record. And if we don't have so much rocks from this Hadean, so from the very early stage of the Earth history, we have quite a lot, around 10% of the geological record that is from the Archean. And it's on this map here in red that you can see we have occurrence and outcrop of Archean geological rock almost everywhere, even in Antarctica. But the two parts that I will mostly discuss is from South Africa and Australia. There is two types of rocks from the Archean that are very emblematic. First is what we call the tonalite trondhjemite granodiorite, or TTG. These rocks are like granite with a lot of silica, but it's Archean granite, and it's really different from what we have now. And this rock can be studied in great detail to better understand how crust formed and what was the first stage of crust formation, but also tectonic evolution. For trace of life, they are not so interesting because they are magmatic rocks that record mostly high pressure and high temperature process. So for looking for trace of life or surface condition, we are looking for sedimentary rocks. And for sedimentary rocks during the Archean, we have three types. We have first what we call chert, that is a very silica-rich rocks, so it's mostly composed of only quartz. We have the banded iron formation, that is a laminated rocks with alternating band of silica and band of iron oxide. And we have stromatolite that can be carbonate, and I will discuss later what is a stromatolite and how they are important for understanding life evolution during this Archean. But first, let's discuss about what was the surface condition of the early Earth, and that starts with what we call the Faint-Young sun paradox. During the very early stage of the Earth, but also of the solar evolution, the sun at that time was younger and so have a very lower luminosity than today. And it is due to the physics of the stellar evolution, and that the energy production is growing with the age of the star. And here you can see on this graph the time in geological time in billion years and the solar luminosity. And so if we look for the Archean, you can see that we have almost 30% less solar luminosity. And with this less luminosity, we can calculate what should have been the surface temperature. And this is what is present here. You have the temperature on one axis, the solar luminosity on the other, and the geological time scale. And you have the freezing point of water. This is the blue line. And you have the solar luminosity curve in yellow. And then you can have two curves. That is the temperature on the Earth that do not have any atmosphere. This is a brown curve, and the temperature on Earth with the current atmosphere. And you can see that both curves cross the freezing line quite very late in the history of the planet. So that means that during the Archean, the surface temperature should have been negative, and so that the water should have been present only as ice. And it's a paradox because liquid water is present very early in the history of time. I can show you here two examples of this banded iron formation that are sedimentary rocks that need liquid water to be formed. And one example is from Ishua, that is south of Greenland, that is 3.8 billion years. You can see here this beautiful laminated black and red rocks. And the other example is Nouveau-Aghitouk at 3.7 billion years in Canada. So we know that at least since 3.8 billion years, there was some ocean water, liquid water, and potentially under the form of ocean at that time. But we also know that we have liquid water even earlier, and that is telling by the Jekyll zircon. So Jekylls, the zircon, it's a locality in Australia. You can see here on the map. It's not a very nice outcrop, as you can see on this field picture. It's a conglomerate that have been heavily altered, but inside this conglomerate, there is tiny crystal that is zircon, that is composed of zirconium and silicate. You can see here on these two pictures the beautiful zirconium crystal. And this mineral is very interesting because first it's a common trace mineral in a lot of granite and magmatic rocks. And it preserves the magma genesis, but is also very resistant to alteration and metamorphisms. These Jekyll zircon have been dated, and they gave age that have Hadean, so they are mostly between 3.8 to 4.4 billion years. So this is the oldest mineral we have on Earth right now. And if we measure the oxygen composition of this zircon, the chemical and isotopic oxygen composition, this composition suggests that the magma from which this grain was crystallized was enriched in clay that imply the presence of water. And this is because the oxygen isotope composition in any kind of mantle zircon should be around 5 per mil. And if you have a higher delta 18O composition, that is called a supracrystal, like here on this picture, you can only produce this higher oxygen composition by integrating some surface sediment and especially clays. So that implies that this Jekyll zircon have been formed from a magma that have incorporating clay-rich petrolite that have been formed in ocean before 4.4 million years old. So the zircon Jekylls tell us that there was some liquid water present on Earth already since the Hadean. And so what is the origin of water on Earth? This is a figure that shows the composition, the amount of water of the world water today based at the scale of the planet. So you can see that even if we have a lot of ocean, the amount of water we have on Earth is not so important. And there is 3 potential sources of this water that can be from meteorites, from the bombardment, or from comets, or from the mantle. And I will discuss quickly these 3. So it has been suggested from a long time and from numerous studies that comets could have contributed to bring some water at the Earth's surface. And that was one of the scientific questions of the last Rosetta mission from the European Space Agency. And this is one of the results they publish. Here you will see the composition in the hydrogen ratio of Earth, of different asteroids, and of some other planet, and also from some comets. And they have measured the composition of the comet, the Jeramanco comet, and then you can see that this composition is heavily enriched in hydrogen in the H ratio. And so one of the conclusions is that if comets have contributed to bringing some water on the Earth's surface, it should not be the main contributor. So it's not excluding a cometary origin, but it cannot be the main contributor. There is a recent study published last year that proposed that the Earth's water was inherited from a kind of chondrite that is called anstatite, so from a meteorite. And this is a nice picture where you can have the provenance of the Earth's water that they propose. At the very beginning of the stage of the planet formation, that you have the proto-Earth, not so far from the sun. You have the snow line and the asteroid belt, and you can see that we have first some water from the building rocks of the planet, from the meteorites, from the anstatite chondrite, and then you can have some input of carbonaceous chondrite, and then also from chondrite. So all of the Earth's ocean from this study, the ocean we have now is inherited of these 3 carriers that are the comet, the anstatite chondrite, and the carbonaceous chondrite. So basically, the ocean we have now is mostly from an extrasolar origin. And this also suggests that we have larger ocean during the Archean. This is a modelization that have been published today, this year, that calculates the amount or the volume of Archean ocean due to the early Archean mantle temperature. And this study proposed that we have larger, but really larger ocean than today. And water is very important, and the presence of ocean is very important for life, but is also very important for plate tectonics. And this is a little schematic from Guillaume Paris when, sorry, it's in French, but you can see that you need to have some ocean to alter the basalt and to alter all of the magmatic rocks to do some serpentinization. You have this nice thin section picture of the serpentinization. So this is the alteration of any kind of oceanic basalt. And serpentinite is a mineral that is fibrous and that is so that facilitated the subduction of rocks into the mantle. So without any water and without any ocean water, it would be very difficult to do subduction and to have the plate tectonic as we know now. So what was the surface? So we know that we have a lot of this ocean, and this ocean was even larger than now. So what was the surface temperature during the Archean? So we can at least try to resolve this Venthion paradox. So we can use to reconstruct the temperature. We can use what we call the oxygen isotope composition. And this is due to the fact that oxygen have different stable isotope, and they will not be incorporated in any minerals. They will be incorporated in minerals phases due to what we call a fractionation, and this fractionation will depend of different factors, but the most important is the temperature. And here you can see the evolution of the temperature, and this curve is drawing the fractionation between the minerals. So here is some quartz phases and the water. So if we know the composition of the mineral phase, we can estimate the temperature. This is what is done regularly in any kind of paleoclimate studies, from mostly carbonates and mostly from foraminifera that are living organisms in the ocean. You can see here a little test of this foraminifera on the microscopic image, and you can see two reconstruction of the ocean temperature from the last million of years. You can then reconstruct the surface temperature due to the Milankovitch cycle or to other parameters from surface change. So what about Archean? In the Archean, we don't have carbonates so much, but what we have is chert, that is a sedimentary rocks that is mostly composed of quartz under various forms, and that is chemically precipitated. And here I show you two examples, one from Australia at the Dresser Chert. You can see the outcrop picture and of these rocks that can be reddish or brown due to trace element inside. And the other example is from the Buck Reef in South Africa. So we can use the oxygen composition of chert to reconstruct the temperature, and that have been done for many decades now. And so on this diagram, published by David Zakharov last year, you can see the evolution of the delta 18O of the water, and you can see the age in millions of years. And the blue is a carbonate, and the green is the chert. And so this is a reconstruction of all paleoclimate studies that have been produced in the literature. And what is very interesting is that both the carbonates and the cherts show this secular variation through time with a lower composition during this the Archean time, and with the modern composition, temperature and composition at now. And you can see this difference between almost 20 per mil variation through time that have been interpreted as reflecting hot ocean during this Archean. So you can see that today the average oceanic temperature should be around 25 degrees. And during the Archean, if we took this reconstruction like that, it should be 70 degrees. So a very, very hot Archean ocean. This approach implies several hypotheses. That first, the cherts and the carbonate are completely in equilibrium with the seawater. And then the second hypothesis that is also very important is that the preservation, they have been preserved since they have been formed. And there is a strong assumption on the oceanic oxygen composition of the water. But when we look at on a chart through a microscope, you can see that it's a complex diagenetic rocks. It's formed only on quartz, but you have different type of quartz. And here it's a thin section image that you have a quartz vein that could have been produced by fluid circulation, so hydrothermal. You have some microquartz that could have been produced formed during diagenesis. And we also have some round detrital grain of quartz. And so what is the significance of the delta 18O of the oxygen isotope composition of this kind of rocks? And this is mostly reflecting these various contributors of different type of quartz. So here you have the oxygen isotope composition measured by different technique. And you can see that more we are looking at a very small scale, so at a very few material use, more we have a huge range of variation. And when we measure only at the rock scale, so what is called the bulk scale by laser fluorination, you have a very homogeneous value, but that is reflecting most likely the proportion of microquartz and megaquartz in these rocks. And here on this optical picture, you have the different form of quartz. You can see the microquartz and the megaquartz, and you can see the little spot of all in situ analysis of the oxygen isotope composition. And so you can see that you have almost 10 per mil variation at this scale. So we have a very large isotopic heterogeneity at a very small scale. And that depends because of this microquartz that is it's composed of very tiny size of quartz. you will have twice a range of almost 20 per mil or 12 per mil, sorry, when you measure it with a 2 micron spot size, and only a 6 per mil when you measure with a 20 micron spot size. And we first interpret this range of isotope composition as reflecting the diagenesis. And that was done a few years ago, that we reconstruct from various charts from the Archean. And by taking account the diagenesis, we found a temperature around 37 to 45 degrees. So that was quite lower than the 70 degrees previously estimated. But now we have a new geochemistry tools, that is the triple oxygen. So oxygen isotope, that oxygen have several isotopes, and we were measuring mostly the 18 and the 16, but now we also are able to measure the 17 at a very good precision. And that has been done by David Zakharov here in picture. And so the notation that I was using before was the delta 18O, and now I will discuss the cap, what we call the cap 17O, that is due to this equation here, that is the difference between the composition of the delta 17 and the delta 18O by taking account the mass-dependent fractionation. It's a very good proxy because with this triple oxygen analysis, you can have the temperature reconstruction, but you can also have the composition of the fluid responsible of the crystallization of the mineral. So in our case, we can have the oceanic temperature, but also the delta 18O of the ocean. And here, this is what looks like this temperature dependence curve for modern silica on a triple oxygen diagram. So if you have the cap 17 on the axis and on the y-axis and the delta 18O on the x-axis, and you can see that the meteoric water line will be different from the equilibrium water line for modern silica. So what David Zakharov has done is that he reanalyzed a lot of different charts for triple oxygen, and this is one of the compilation of one of the results with the published literature. So you can see that all of the charts measured so far plot below this equilibrium seawater curve. So it's very difficult to interpret that all of this chart was chemically precipitated at equilibrium in an ocean at that time, because they are clearly not plotting on this equilibrium line. But if we look in detail on what was the charts and how we can interpret them, we can see here that we have charts have recorded a mixing of hydrothermal fluid and seawater. And this is what is showing here. On the top diagram, you have this different line from different hydrothermal fluid. So you have some fluid from hydrothermal setting in Iceland, from oceanic quartz, and from silica precipitated in different hydrothermal setting. And if we do the same modeling and calculation for the Archean charts, you have the result on this diagram here. And then you can see that most of the charts of the Archean charts have been produced during a mixing of hydrothermal and seawater. So basically, one of the sad conclusion of this story is that we cannot use charts for reconstructing the seawater temperature, because they are most likely formed during this mixing of hydrothermal and seawater fluid, and so they can have record higher temperature than any kind of surface oceanic temperature. But what was interesting is that if we calculate the oxygen isotope composition of the ocean, and this is a result of the modeling, we know that the ocean should have the same or similar oxygen isotope composition than today. And that is very interesting, because that have a lot of implication on the hydrogeological cycle for ocean, but also for the tectonics. So how do we solve the Fantine-Youngson paradox? Because even if we know that we cannot really predict what was the surface temperature, but we know that it was somewhere between 0 to 70 degrees Celsius, or 30 degrees during the Precambrian. So for that, we need to have a greenhouse effect. And this is illustrated here, that today we all know that we have a greenhouse effect that is getting stronger and stronger. But during the Archean, we have a very stronger greenhouse effect with a lot more possibly CO2 in the atmosphere and weaker solar radiation. And the Archean greenhouse effect can be modeled by a different global climatic system. And here you have one of the results of this latest modelization or calculation, that you have the peak CO2, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere from time, and you have in this different line and different dot the different publication data. So you can see that we have some publications that show that we have a very low CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, but quite already important for a greenhouse effect. And then if you do something with that, you add some methane and also some nitrogen, you will have a greenhouse effect that should be intermediate. And the purple curve is when you have only CO2 in the atmosphere. So what is interesting with this modeling is that it looks like we can have a greenhouse effect that was not so stronger than previously suggested if you take account other gases than CO2, so let's methane and also some nitrogen, but also what this modeling show, and is very interesting, is that this the effect of this greenhouse, or the concentration of a greenhouse gas, will depend on this modelization of the amount of emerged land. That is also not a resolved question right now, and the amount of cloud in the Archean. So on the top diagram, you have different modeling from Archean greenhouse effect. If you have the same amount of emerged land than today, only a big continent or no continent at all. And on the bottom, you have this different greenhouse effect on the current Earth and on the Archean Earth with no ozone and a little bit more of CO2, and what will be the effect of the cloud. So we can solve the Sun paradox effect by a greenhouse effect, and now this greenhouse effect do not necessitate to be so stronger than previously hypothesized. So the image we have from the Archean should look like this. So this is an artistic view. That should be a very blue planet with a lot of ocean. That is, ocean were also larger than today. Very few continent or very few emerged land, and some cloud. And maybe in this cloud, we should have a lot of organic matter. So quite an hospitable world for life to appear. And so this is the second question I want to discuss today, is that when life did appear. That is one of the big questions. But let's just focus on what are the oldest traces of life we can find in the geological record. So what we call a trace of life is very easy. It's a trace in the rocks that have been left by any kind of biological activity. So here I can show you, that can be any kind of fossil from this arthropod, so that is very old shrimp basically, to some leaf or some little bird here, or that can be also what we call a biosignature. So here you can see the footprint of on the moon. That is also a trace of life. And if we look back to the geological record, it's quite easy for most of the Phanerozoic to recognize what was a fossil and what is a trace of life. So here I show you some of these emblematic fossil. You have obviously the humanoid fossil from Australopithecus, that there is no question that it was a living animal. There is also this big dinosaur, so even extinct animal we can still recognize in the geological record. But more we are going back to time, you can see this leaf that is also quite easily recognized. And then when we go to 600 million years, you have this kind of spongy form that looks like a little bit less a trace of life, but it's still recognizable as an animal at that time. But what is the question of Precambrian. Precambrian is complicated, and this is one of the example of two paper, and so that both claim that it was a trace of life. And so you can see that we are not at all on the same scale. So now we are looking at micrometer scale, so the same size than your hair, basically. And so this is in two sedimentary rocks. So you can see this little sphere and globules on the left, and this little, I don't know exactly how to call this shape on the right. And so here it's difficult to assess that it's a trace of life, but it's also even more difficult to know what kind of organisms was present at that time. And it's because we are using mostly morphology as a criteria, but here I show you some pictures that looks like flowers in false color. That looks like very beautiful flowers, but it's not at all flowers. This is a synthetic chemical garden produced in laboratory by varying the concentration of different chemical species. And there is no biology at all involved in this experiment. So morphology is not at all an absolute criteria, because a lot of process can also produce very biological form. What we can look is the organic matter or the carbon, because most of the life we know now is based on the carbon. And so if we look from the carbon in the geological record, we can see how it will evolve. And this is a nice resume of what is the evolution of carbon during a geological history. So if you start from any kind of biological organic matter, so it's composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and then these rocks will be cooked a little bit during diagenesis, so we will lose a lot of these elements, especially the hydrogen, the nitrogen, and the oxygen, and the carbon will start to reorganize. And then we will have something that is inert graphitic carbon or disorder, that we will still have a lot of carbon, but a very lower concentration in hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And more we are eating the rocks, more we are increasing the temperature, so during the metamorphisms, we will have crystalline graphite that is almost pure carbon. It is what we use for writing. And so we are progressively we lost any kind of biological information during this process. And because most of the Archean rocks have been undergone diagenesis and metamorphisms, it's always difficult to find what was the origin of this organic. So I will show you some of this example. So a few years ago, there was this paper that claimed that they found biogenic carbon preserved in this Jekyll zircon. So the same one I show you for the existence of water on Earth. They found this tiny inclusion of globule of carbon in this 4.1 billion years. And so they were, in the paper, they suggest that this carbon was from a biological origin. This paper is very controversial because it looks like, or potentially, that it was some contamination. Because first, the carbon in this Jekyll zircon is not so dissolved that it should, it's more dissolved than it should have been. Because the zircon Jekylls have been crystallized around 600 degrees. And so here you can see on the right panel, the evolution of the Raman spectra. So basically this is, we are looking for the structure of the organic matter at different temperature. And so the Raman spectra we should have for this kind of Jekyll zircon should be almost on the top. So a very sharp one with only one bond of carbon. And what they found in this study is something like more disorder. So this carbon do not looks like it was syngenetic, and that is been formed and included during the Jekylls zircon history. But it's still a controversy. Another controversy is called the apex chert. This is a chert in Australia that is 3.5 billion years old. And that is a very long time controversy, because the first paper have been published in the 70s. And it's still going on. And so this is one of the example of the form they found in this chart. So you can find this kind of worm shape that is very rich in organics. And so it has been interpreted at first as reflecting the presence of potentially cyanobacteria that you can see here on the picture of the microscope, a modern cyanobacteria. And it looks like similar. But we also have a problem during this on this apex charts is that the locality, what is called the Schopf locality from the first papers that have been published, it's not at all a sedimentary surface environment. It's an hydrothermal vein, as you can see here on this nice schematic. And so this morphology and this form, this compound, could be completely abiotic, produced during hydrothermalisms. And this is what have been proposed by various authors, is that this apex charts microfossil is mineral artifact produced during phyllosilicate exfoliation. So it's not a cyanobacteria fossil, but it's a chemical process during hydrothermal and phyllosilicate exfoliation and hydrothermal circulation. So we have to be careful when we interpret any kind of fossil in the geological record. So what are the other oldest traces of life? One of the less disputable is come from Isua, so it's from the south of Greenland. It's a very remote place that is a very nice preserved greenstone belt, so with a lot of volcanic and sedimentary rocks from the Archean, and all date from 3.8 billion years. And in these rocks, they have found carbon inclusion in apatite. Apatite is a phosphate mineral. So here you can see the rocks at the outcrop scale, and then you can see the detail of this tiny inclusion. And you can see on this picture all of this little black organic matter. So this carbon have been measured for the structural part and for also this carbon isotope composition. And what is very interesting is that it has a very low delta C13 that is completely compatible with the potential biological origin. And also what is very interesting is that we know that metamorphisms is modifying heavily the carbon isotope composition, as you can see here, that you will reduce progressively the range of variation. And here in the Isua, we still have a large range of variation with very low delta 13C value. So that it's difficult to explain the presence of this carbon, but also the structure and the carbon isotope composition without any biological signature. The trace of life we all agree on is what we call stromatolite, and this is a nice paper that have been published a few years ago that call for respect for stromatolite because the structure are from a microbial origin, and this is maybe a perfect target to understand how life evolved on the Archean Earth. So what is a stromatolite? Stromatolite is a rocks that is formed through the activity of microbial consortia. Here it's an example from the Bahamas, from a modern stromatolite. So you can see this structure in cauliflowers that are living in the ocean. If you cut inside, you will find an association of minerals and microbes with various color. And if we zoom on the top part of this stromatolite, you will find that the microbes are completely organized in community, and this community is following a gradient, a different gradient, different geochemical gradient. So first, the light is not going so much deeper in the stromatolite. So the first top of the stromatolite is from cyanobacteria. This is this green, and that is giving this green aspect of the living stromatolite. And more you go deeper, less and less you have light, and so less and less you have photosynthesis, and so you have more and more anoxic condition. So we have a gradient of light, and also of redox condition through the first millimeter of what we call this microbial mat. And because of these microbial activities, they are producing byproducts that are mostly minerals. And this is a unique archive because we have stromatolite now, and we also have stromatolite since the Archean. So we can really study stromatolites through the geological time and understand them. During the Archean, the stromatolites are giant. So here is two examples, one from the Pilbara. You can see this nice dome where people are standing. And this is another example from Malmani where the stromatolite can be 2 meters large. So they were very huge. And one possibility to explain why they were so big at that time is that it's because there was not so much other predator. So they were the king and queen of life at that time. And so this is funny to study stromatolite because you can both study them in the geological record. So here is some picture of a drill core in South Africa in the Malmani platform, and you can also study them today in the Bahamas. And you can really compare them. So one of the best example of Archean stromatolite is from Strelepool, so in Australia, in this Pilbara craton. This is on this little star. And here we have very beautiful stromatolite, very well preserved. You can see here on the outcrop, and you have the scene section of the picture, and also you have the chemical map. So this stromatolite is composed of you still have the laminar structure that is carbonate mostly. And because it's Archean rock, and all of the Archean rock have been silicified, you also have some quartz, where when you study a stromatolite now in the Bahamas, they are only carbonate, composed of carbonate. And Strelepool is very interesting because you can recognize different morphology and different type of stromatolite, and this is interpreted as a reef, so it could be something corresponding to the Bahamas today. So a shallow water platform with a lot of different type of stromatolite. And inside some of the cherts, so not exactly the stromatolite, but some other sediment close to the Strelepool stromatolite, they have found microfossil. So if you cut these rocks, you can find some tiny particles of carbon that have various morphology and form. You can see this little weird shape and some tube and film, and the structure, but also the isotope composition of this structure is completely compatible with the biological origin. So that should have been some microbes or some byproduct of microbes in the preserve at 3.5 billion years. So for most of the scientific community, Strelepool stromatolite is one of the best examples of what is a trace of life. But also, there is a lot of other studies that have shown that we can estimate what was the metabolic activity of some of these microbes in Strelepool. So this is one example by Thomas Bontagnali, who have measured the sulfur isotope composition, because a lot of microbes can use sulfur as an electron acceptor or even an electron donor, depending on their metabolic activity. And so if we measure the sulfur isotope composition of the organics, but also the pyrite, you can have a good overview of what was sulfur cycling, the biological sulfur cycling at that time. And in this paper, they show that we already have some biological mediated activity, metabolic activity of sulfur cycle at 3.5 billion years old in stromatolite. And we know that in modern stromatolite, we have a very strong sulfur biogeochemical cycle too. And so if we look back what we know on life evolution, we have an idea of what was undisputed evidence of life that is here. This is what I show you, this Strelepool stromatolite. And then we can go from the rock record. So the first rock record is 4 billion years old. And what Strelepool imply on the life evolution is that if we already have some microorganisms and potentially some microorganisms consortia, so a little bit of ecosystem, that implies that the origin of life should have been very early in the Earth's history. And this is a potential life tree proposed with the first cell that have appeared somewhere before 4 billion years old. And so, do we have stromatolite before 3.5? Few years ago, there was claimed that it was a stromatolite found in Isua at 3.7, and this is a picture of what was the stromatolite. It's very small, it's centimetric, this dome, in these quartz carbonate rocks. Unfortunately, this study have been disputed by several others, and it doesn't look like it's a first stromatolite, but it looks like it's a metamorphic rocks. So this is the same rocks on the right, where you can see the dome on one side of the cut, but not on the other one. On the other one, you see it's a lamina. Where when you cut a stromatolite is a 3D object, so you will have the morphology in all directions, independently of where you cut. And also there was this recent study published by Zawadski last year that have reanalyzed also these rocks and show with geochemical studies that it's quartz carbonate rocks that have been heavily deformed and metamorphosed during early stage. So you can see here the little model of this lamina rocks with the carbonates and the quartz. So the carbonate in blue and the quartz in brown, and then if you deform, you can produce this shape, this morphology. Also, the dome are not pointing in the right direction because the formation has been tilted. So far there is no stromatolite older than 3.5. And so we have this stromatolite at 3.4 billion years old. We have some microfossil at 3.2 billion years old. We have cyanobacteria evidence of around 1.9 billion years old, and protists and alga almost at 1 billion years old. And so here, if you look the geological timescale, you can put the origin of life before 4 billion years old, so even before 4.3 for some of them, and then you will have the evolution of two very important metabolic activities that are the methanogenesis and the photosynthesis that should have evolved very early in the Archean. And that is very interesting. And so it looks like the stromatolite record already a microbial ecosystem that have been that is already well organized at that at 3.5 billion years old. So even if our picture of how life appear and evolve on Earth is still blurry a little bit, we are really, there is real progress made on what was the metabolic activity and metabolic evolution at that time. And this is also this kind of same record, but only based on the geological record, where we found the stromatolite and what we call also the microbial induced structures, the different fossil, microfossil we can find. The biomarker, unfortunately, cannot be used during the Archean because there is too many problems of contamination and preservation. And there is a lot of different works right now on better constraining the metabolic activity of various of important process like the photosynthesis and the sulfur and iron biogeochemical cycles that are very important for life evolution. So to conclude, it's pretty clear that the surface conditions of the Archean were compatible with life emergence, and we have a lot of ocean, we have surface temperatures that should be warm but not so hot, and so completely compatible with any kind of life emergence. And we have the oldest origin of non-disputable trace of life at 3.4 billion years, and with a potential microbial ecosystem that imply a very early origin of life on Earth. And stromatolite are a key archive for understanding both surface condition and microbial activity, and because they are formed in a shallow water environment. And I hope that I show you that we need a multi-proxy study and, and various criteria to assessing what is a trace of life in the geological record. And with that, I want to thank all of the people that have contributed to any kind of research on the Archean, and I will be happy to take any question.